In the early years of the 20th century, as rail lines stitched together small American towns and the new art of motion pictures flickered uncertainly in storefront theatres, a child was born in the quiet Midwest who would one day come to embody the vast landscapes of the American West. John Wayne, known to millions simply as the Duke, would become one of the most enduring figures in Hollywood history. For decades, his steady stride, measured speech, and commanding presence defined the Western hero in the minds of audiences around the world. He did not rush across the screen, he occupied it. He did not speak quickly, he allowed words to settle with weight and clarity. His life spanned eras of profound change, from silent film to widescreen epics, from the Great Depression to the Cold War. Through these decades, his screen image became intertwined with ideas of courage, resilience, and frontier myth. In this quiet telling, we will move gently from his beginnings in Iowa to the wide deserts of Monument Valley, from early uncertainty to lasting fame. If this journey through American film history offers calm companionship, you may choose to follow along with future stories and perhaps share where in the world you are listening as this one unfolds. Now we begin at the very beginning in a small town far from Hollywood. John Wayne was born Marion Robert Morrison on May 26, 1907, in Winterset, Iowa. The town lay amid rolling farmland and open sky, its streets quiet and orderly. Wooden houses lined modest roads. Life moved at an unhurried pace, shaped by seasons and community ties. His father, Clyde Leonard Morrison, worked variously as a pharmacist and farmer, while his mother, Mary Alberta Brown, carried a strong and steady presence within the household. The Morrison family's circumstances shifted during Marion's early childhood. Economic uncertainty prompted relocation, and when he was still young, the family moved westward to Southern California. The journey from Iowa to California marked more than a change of geography. It placed young Marion within a region that would soon become the center of the American film industry. Yet at the time of his arrival, Hollywood was still emerging, its studios scattered among orange groves and open fields. The family settled first in Palmdale, before eventually establishing themselves in Glendale near Los Angeles. California offered brighter skies and different rhythms. The Pacific air carried warmth, and the landscape stretched outward in dry hills and coastal plains. Marion's childhood in California was shaped by modest means and quiet discipline. His father's business ventures did not always succeed, and financial strain was a recurring presence. These early experiences instilled a sense of responsibility and resilience. He attended local schools in Glendale, where he was known as a serious and reliable student. Tall for his age, broad-shouldered even in youth, he developed an interest in athletics. Physical activity offered both confidence and direction. He excelled particularly in football, where strength and endurance were valued. It was during these school years that he acquired the nickname Duke. The name originated from his childhood habit of accompanying the family's large Airedale dog, also named Duke. Neighbours and friends began referring to the boy and the dog together, and over time the nickname adhered to him. It would remain with him for the rest of his life. The combination of athletic discipline and quiet self-assurance began to define his demeanour. Teachers described him as dependable rather than flamboyant. He did not seek attention, yet his physical presence made him noticeable. His movements were deliberate, his speech measured even in youth. Meanwhile, Southern California in the 1910s was undergoing transformation. Motion picture companies, drawn by consistent sunlight and varied landscapes, established studios in and around Los Angeles. Westerns, comedies, and dramas were filmed against hills and desert backdrops that would later become iconic. Though Marion was not yet directly involved in film, he grew up within proximity to its early growth. The wide open spaces of California, which would later frame his screen image, were part of his daily surroundings. His home life emphasized order and expectation. His mother encouraged discipline and education, instilling in him a belief in personal responsibility. His father, though facing business challenges, maintained an air of dignity. By his teenage years, Marion Morrison had developed into a tall, athletic young man with a steady gaze and reserved manner. The foundations of the persona later associated with John Wayne, physical solidity, quiet confidence, and measured speech, were already forming, though neither he nor those around him could foresee the scale upon which they would one day be projected. The journey from Winterset to California had set him on a path shaped by movement westward, a path that mirrored the broader American narrative of expansion. For now, however, he remained a student and athlete in Glendale, unaware that the hills beyond his classroom would soon become cinematic frontiers. The boy called Duke stood at the edge of adolescence, the wide horizon of Southern California before him, and a future that would unfold slowly, step by steady step. As Marion Duke Morrison entered his teenage years in Glendale, California, the rhythms of his life settled into patterns shaped by school, athletics, and family responsibility. Glendale High School stood amid sunlit streets and modest homes, framed by low hills that rose gently toward the horizon. The climate was mild, suggested endurance. Yet his demeanor remained reserved. He was not known for theatrical display or restless energy. Instead, he moved with deliberate calm, speaking in a low, measured tone that classmates would later recall with familiarity. Football became central to his identity. The discipline of the sport, its structured practices, its emphasis on teamwork, its physical demands, suited him. He played with determination rather than flash. Coaches recognized in him a reliability that extended beyond the field. He arrived on time, listened carefully, and carried out instructions without complaint. The nickname Duke, already established in childhood, followed him into adolescence. It felt less like a boast than an acknowledgement of presence. The name carried weight, befitting the young man who rarely hurried and rarely faltered. At home, financial pressures persisted. His father's ventures did not provide consistent stability, and Duke understood from an early age that achievement would require effort. His mother's expectations reinforced that understanding. Education, discipline, and personal conduct were not optional. They were foundations. The growing film industry lay only a short distance away in Hollywood. Studios were expanding, and western landscapes of Southern California were increasingly used as backdrops for motion pictures. Yet Duke's early ambitions did not center on acting. His focus remained on athletics and the possibility of higher education. By his final years at Glendale High School, he had distinguished himself sufficiently to attract attention from the University of Southern California. A football scholarship offered him the opportunity to continue his studies while competing at a higher level. For a young man of modest means, this path promised advancement. In 1925, he enrolled at USC. The campus, with its red-tiled roofs and open courtyards, represented both aspiration and challenge. College football demanded greater intensity. Practices were rigorous, competition fierce. Duke embraced the routine, building strength and endurance. Yet fate intervened quietly. During his time at USC, he suffered a shoulder injury while body surfing, an injury that effectively ended his football scholarship. Without athletic funding, continuing formal education became financially difficult. The setback altered his trajectory, though not immediately in dramatic fashion. To support himself, Duke sought employment. Through connections at USC, he found work at local film studios, initially as a prop man and labourer. The tasks were practical: moving equipment, arranging sets, assisting where needed. He entered the studio environment not as performer but as worker. These early days on film lots introduced him to a new world. Cameras rolled under bright lights, directors called instructions, actors moved through scenes with practiced gestures. The work required coordination and patience. Among the directors active during this period was John Ford, whose influence would later become central to Duke's career. At first, however, Duke remained in the background, observing rather than participating. His presence did not go unnoticed. Tall and physically commanding, he occasionally appeared as an extra in silent films. These roles were small, background figures, soldiers, townsmen, but they offered exposure to the mechanics of performance. Standing before the camera even briefly required composure. The transition from athlete to studio worker unfolded gradually. Duke did not immediately envision himself as a leading man. Acting seemed distant from his original ambitions, yet the environment of early Hollywood, still fluid and experimental, allowed for unexpected movement. The lessons learned on football fields, endurance, teamwork, acceptance of physical strain, translated naturally to studio life. Long hours on set demanded patience. repetition of scenes required focus. Duke approached each task steadily. The late 1920s were years of expansion for Hollywood. Silent films grew longer and more ambitious. Studios experimented with sound technology. The industry's future seemed open and uncertain. Within that uncertainty, Duke Morrison stood at a threshold. His football scholarship had ended, but another path had opened quietly before him. What began as practical employment on a studio lot would soon evolve into something more substantial. The young man from Winterset and Glendale had not sought the screen, yet the screen, in time, would seek him. By the late 1920s, the Marion Duke Morrison had become a familiar figure on studio lots in Southern California. What had begun as practical employment, hauling props, arranging equipment, assisting where needed, gradually evolved into something closer to apprenticeship. The film industry was still young enough that boundaries between roles were porous. A reliable worker might be asked to stand in for an actor. A background extra might receive a line. Opportunity often emerged quietly. Duke moved through this environment with steady attentiveness. He observed camera placement, lighting adjustments, and the careful choreography required for even simple scenes. Silent films demanded clarity of gesture and posture. Without spoken dialogue, expression was carried through movement and facial composure. He watched experienced performers closely, noting how they conveyed intention without exaggeration. Among the figures working regularly in this period was John Ford. Ford, already developing a reputation for disciplined direction and visual storytelling, noticed the tall young man who carried himself with unhurried assurance. Duke began appearing in small roles in Ford's productions, often uncredited, sometimes only briefly visible. Yet these appearances provided instruction. The late silent era was also marked by rapid technological transition. Studios were experimenting with synchronized sound. Microphones were being tested. Actors accustomed to silent technique faced uncertain adaptation. Within this shifting landscape, Duke's lack of established reputation became an advantage. He was not yet defined by a single style. In 1930, a significant opportunity arrived. Director Raoul Walsh selected him for the lead role in an ambitious western titled The Big Trail. The production was notable not only for its scale but for its technical innovation. It was filmed in an early widescreen format known as 70mm grandeur, an experiment that sought to expand the visual field and deepen audience immersion. For this role, Marion Morrison was given a new name, John Wayne. The change was deliberate. Studio executives believed Marion sounded too delicate for a frontier hero. John Wayne conveyed firmness and simplicity. The name settled upon him with quiet finality. The Big Trail was a sweeping production. It followed a wagon train across expansive American landscapes, filmed on location with sweeping vistas. Now Wayne's physical presence, broad-shouldered, deliberate in movement, suited the role. He rode horseback with ease and projected steadiness before the camera. Yet despite its ambition, the film struggled commercially. The grandeur format required specialized projection equipment that few theaters possessed. As a result, its exhibition was limited. The economic climate of the early 1930s, shadowed by the onset of the Great Depression, further constrained audience turnout. For John Wayne, the film's disappointment marked a setback. A debut in such a large production might have secured immediate stardom. Instead, he found himself returning to smaller roles and modest budgets. The promise of instant elevation dissolved into years of steady but unremarkable work. Throughout the early 1930s, he appeared in numerous low-budget westerns produced by studios such as Monogram and Republic Pictures. These films were often categorized as B-westerns, shorter and produced with limited resources. The settings were simple, the plots direct. Yet within these constraints, Wayne refined his screen presence. The repetition of Western themes allowed him to develop consistency and posture, vocal tone, and pacing. Sound had by now become standard in film, and his deep, measured voice began to define his persona. Unlike many silent-era performers who struggled with dialogue, Wayne adapted with relative ease. His speech was slow, deliberate, and grounded. The B-Western years were formative. They required endurance rather than glamour. Production schedules were tight. Budgets were modest. There was little room for error. Wayne learned efficiency and focus. He honed the controlled stride and quiet authority that would later define his major roles. Though these films did not bring widespread acclaim, they built familiarity. Audiences who frequented Western theatres began to recognise him. He became associated with frontier resilience, with the calm lawman or determined trail guide. Behind the scenes, he maintained discipline similar to his football years. Long hours did not disturb him. Physical demands were met without complaint. The persona that would later seem effortless was being constructed through repetition and restraint. The early 1930s were not a period of dazzling ascent. They were years of groundwork. The name John Wayne slowly replaced Marion Morrison in public consciousness. The tall young man from Glendale was shaping himself into something enduring. In 1939, the turning point would arrive with Stagecoach, directed by John Ford. But that transformation belonged to a chapter still ahead. For now, Wayne stood in modest western towns built from painted wood, riding through dust-filled streets under steady sunlight, learning patience. After the disappointment of the Big Trail in 1930, John Wayne did not return to obscurity, but he did return to work that required patience. The early promise of leading a large-scale epic had not immediately translated into stardom. Instead, he entered a demanding period of steady production in what were known as B-Western films. These pictures were economical and efficient. Produced quickly and shown often as part of double features, they told straightforward stories of frontier justice. Towns were built from simple facades. Saloons, jailhouses, dusty main streets. These sets were reused and rearranged across productions. Budgets were modest. Shooting schedules were brief. Wayne appeared in dozens of such films throughout the early and mid-1930s. Titles like Riders of Destiny, The Trail Beyond, and The Lawless Frontier followed familiar patterns. A mysterious rider would arrive in a troubled town. Conflict would unfold. Order would be restored. To outside observers, these productions may have seemed repetitive, though yet for Wayne, they were apprenticeship. Each film allowed him to refine his screen identity. He learned how to enter a frame slowly, commanding attention through stillness rather than motion. He practiced speaking lines in a low, measured cadence that carried authority without strain. The Western genre suited him physically. On horseback he appeared natural and grounded. His broad shoulders and steady gaze conveyed confidence. He did not rush dialogue. He allowed pauses to settle. Over time, this pacing became part of his signature. The early 1930s were also marked by economic hardship across the United States. The Great Depression shaped audience expectations. Films provided escape, but they also reflected ideals of endurance and moral clarity. The Western, with its themes of perseverance and frontier resilience, resonated with viewers navigating uncertain times. Wayne's roles during this period were often uncomplicated. The heroes he portrayed were direct in purpose and firm in conviction. They faced adversity without visible doubt. Though these films lacked the prestige of major studio productions, they reinforced an association between Wayne and steady determination. Behind the scenes, he remained disciplined. Years earlier, the end of his football scholarship had required adjustment. Now, the absence of immediate stardom required a different kind of resilience. Rather than withdrawing, he continued working. His collaboration with director John Ford, though limited during these years, did not disappear entirely. Ford had observed Wayne's growth and retained awareness of his potential. The quiet connection between them would later prove decisive. During the mid-1930s, Wayne's performances gained subtle depth. Though scripts remained simple, he began incorporating restraint into his portrayals. Instead of exaggerated gestures, he relied on posture and controlled expression. The camera, now fully adapted to sound production, favoured close framing. Wayne's calm presence translated well to this intimacy. He also developed an ease with dialogue that distinguished him from some contemporaries. His voice, low and steady, carried conviction without theatrical flourish. It suggested someone accustomed to open landscapes and practical decisions. By 1938, after nearly a decade of consistent but modest work, Wayne had appeared in more than 60 films. He was known within the industry as dependable and efficient, yet he was not yet regarded as a leading star of major studio releases. Then, in 1939, an opportunity emerged that would alter his course. John Ford planned a Western titled Stagecoach. The project brought together an ensemble cast and aimed to elevate the genre beyond its B-movie status. Ford cast Wayne in the role of the Ringo Kid, a character who embodied both quiet strength and moral complexity. When Stagecoach was released in 1939, audiences took notice. The film's visual composition, narrative depth, and ensemble performances distinguished it from the routine westerns of the preceding decade. Wayne's entrance in the film, stepping forward with rifle in hand, framed against Monument Valley, became iconic. The years of apprenticeship had prepared him. The measured stride, the calm voice, the sense of grounded authority, all had been shaped in smaller productions. Now, within a larger framework, those qualities resonated more powerfully. The turning point had arrived not through sudden transformation, but through accumulation. The B-Western years had not been glamorous. They had required persistence. But they had formed the foundation upon which a lasting screen persona could stand. In 1939, as the United States stood at the edge of a new global era and Hollywood entered one of its most celebrated years, John Wayne stepped into a role that would alter the course of his career. The film was Stagecoach, directed by John Ford. The Western genre, long associated with modest budgets and predictable plots, would in this production find new stature. The story followed a small group of travellers journeying by stagecoach through dangerous territory. The characters came from varied backgrounds: a banker, a prostitute, a doctor, a southern gentleman, and among them rode the Ringo Kid, portrayed by Wayne. The Ringo Kid was an escaped prisoner seeking justice for the murder of his family. Yet unlike the straightforward heroes of earlier B-Westerns, Ringo carried depth and restraint. Wayne's first appearance in the film became one of the most remembered entrances in American cinema. The stagecoach halts. The camera cuts to a distant figure standing in the open landscape. He twirls his rifle with ease. The lens slowly draws closer, revealing his face, calm, determined, steady. It was not a flamboyant introduction. There was no rush, no dramatic speech. Instead, there was presence. The wide desert backdrop of Monument Valley framed him in quiet majesty. The landscape itself seemed to affirm the solidity of the character. Ford's direction elevated the Western beyond routine action. He used the open spaces of the American Southwest not merely as scenery, but as character. Monument Valley's towering rock formations rose behind the stagecoach like ancient sentinels. Against that vastness, Wayne's deliberate movements acquired scale. The years of B-Western apprenticeship prepared him for this moment. He did not overplay the role, his gestures were minimal, his speech was slow and grounded, he allowed silence to carry meaning. In scenes of tension, he remained composed, suggesting inner strength without overt display. Stagecoach was released in a year that included other major films, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And yet within that remarkable cinematic landscape, Stagecoach stood apart for revitalizing a genre many had considered exhausted. Critics noted its craftsmanship. Audiences responded to its characters. The film achieved both commercial and artistic success. For Wayne, it marked the end of anonymity within secondary westerns and the beginning of major studio recognition. Suddenly, the tall actor who had spent nearly a decade refining his persona in modest productions found himself cast in larger projects. Offers expanded beyond low-budget westerns. His name carried weight in promotional materials. Yet even as fame approached, his demeanour remained steady. He did not abandon the qualities shaped during earlier years. Instead, he carried them into broader visibility. The partnership between Wayne and Ford deepened through this collaboration. Ford recognized that Wayne embodied something elemental, a physical authenticity aligned with frontier myth. Wayne, in turn, trusted Ford's direction. Their professional relationship would shape numerous films in the decades ahead. The Ringo Kid was neither invincible nor flamboyant. He was direct, principled, and measured. These qualities resonated deeply with audiences navigating uncertain times. In 1939, as war erupted in Europe, American viewers saw in Ringo a figure of steady resolve. The Western, through Stagecoach, achieved renewed legitimacy. It could tell stories of moral complexity and human community, not merely gunfights and chases. Wayne's performance anchored that transformation. In the years that followed, he would appear in films that expanded upon the persona glimpsed here, sometimes reinforcing it, sometimes complicating it. But the essential foundation had been laid. The camera's slow advance toward his face in Monument Valley marked more than an entrance into a single film. It signaled the arrival of a screen presence shaped by patience and restraint. The horizon had turned. After the success of Stagecoach in 1939, John Wayne entered the 1940s no longer as a dependable Western actor, but as a rising star. The transformation was not sudden in demeanour. He remained measured and deliberate, yet his visibility expanded quickly, and major studios cast him in larger productions, and his name began appearing prominently in advertising. The early years of the decade were marked by global uncertainty. Europe had entered war in 1939, and by December 1941, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States formally joined the conflict. The nation mobilized swiftly. Hollywood too responded, producing films that reflected patriotic themes and wartime realities. Wayne's screen persona aligned naturally with the cultural mood. His characters often embodied stoicism, courage, and directness, qualities the public associated with American resilience. He appeared in films such as Flying Tigers, 1942, portraying American volunteer pilots aiding China before the United States formally entered the war. In Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949, slightly later in the decade, he would portray a Marine sergeant with stern authority and layered complexity, but the groundwork for that persona was laid during the war years. Throughout World War II, Wayne continued acting rather than serving in the armed forces. This decision would later draw scrutiny, yet during the war itself, his films contributed to morale and public support. The draft board classified him as eligible for service, but his age and family responsibilities influenced deferments. At the time, the film industry was considered important to national morale, and several actors remained stateside for that reason. And Wayne approached wartime roles with seriousness. His characters were often disciplined leaders or steady companions. He did not portray flamboyant heroics. Instead, he conveyed endurance. His measured speech and grounded posture suggested reliability amid chaos. One of the defining films of this period was They Were Expendable, 1945, directed by John Ford. The film depicted the experiences of PT boat crews in the Pacific during the early stages of the war. As Wayne portrayed Lieutenant John Brickley, a character marked by quiet determination rather than overt bravado. The film's tone was reflective and somber, capturing not triumph, but sacrifice. The collaboration with Ford during these years deepened their professional bond. Ford himself served in the US Navy and brought a documentary sensibility to wartime storytelling. Wayne's performance in They Were Expendable reflected maturation. The youthful directness of the Ringo Kid had evolved into something steadier, more restrained. The 1940s also brought expansion beyond Western settings. Wayne appeared in adventure films and dramas that explored themes of duty and leadership, yet the Western remained central to his identity. The open landscapes and frontier narratives continued to resonate with audiences navigating a world at war. His physical presence, now fully established, conveyed authority. He moved slowly but purposefully. In scenes of confrontation, he rarely raised his voice unnecessarily. The strength of his screen image lay in controlled intensity. Off-screen, his public identity began to merge with his roles. Interviews and public appearances reinforced an association between Wayne and patriotic conviction. He spoke plainly and directly, often aligning with conservative viewpoints. The image of the dependable American hero extended beyond film. By the war's end in 1945, Wayne had secured his place as a leading actor. The boy from Winterset, once uncertain of his career after a failed widescreen experiment, now stood among Hollywood's most recognizable figures. The war years had strengthened his association with resilience. His characters faced danger with calm acceptance. That steadiness, refined over years of practice, resonated deeply with audiences seeking reassurance. As peace returned, the nation would shift into a different chapter, one marked by prosperity, political tension, and cultural change. Wayne's career would expand further in scope and complexity. But in the 1940s, amid wartime headlines and cinematic tributes, John Wayne solidified his image as a figure of measured strength, a presence as constant as the desert horizon. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, the United States entered a period of adjustment and growth. Soldiers returned home. Industry shifted from wartime production to peacetime expansion. Suburbs spread outward from cities, and cinema remained a central form of shared experience. Within this evolving landscape, John Wayne's screen persona began to deepen. The late 1940s brought a series of westerns that expanded the emotional range of the genre. No longer confined to straightforward tales of frontier justice, these films explored tension, authority, and moral complexity, and Wayne stood at the centre of this transformation. In Red River, 1948, directed by Howard Hawks, Wayne portrayed Thomas Dunson, a cattle rancher leading a long and dangerous drive along the Chisholm Trail. Dunson was not merely heroic, he was stern, even authoritarian. His rigid leadership strained relationships with those under his command, particularly his adopted son, played by Montgomery Clift. The film presented Wayne in a new light. His character's strength bordered on inflexibility. He did not portray anger through frantic. He did not portray anger through frantic movement, but through stillness and quiet authority. Red River marked a shift. The Western hero could be flawed, shaped by stubborn pride as much as courage. Wayne's performance demonstrated that his screen presence could accommodate this nuance. Soon after, he reunited with John Ford for Fort Apache, 1948, part of what would later be called Ford's Cavalry Trilogy. In this film, Wayne played Captain Kirby York, an experienced officer serving under an arrogant superior. The role allowed him to embody patience and restraint in contrast to misguided authority. The landscape of Monument Valley once again framed his figure. Ford's use of wide horizons and deliberate pacing reinforced the sense that these stories were not merely about gunfire, but about the shaping of community and responsibility on the frontier. Through these films, Wayne's persona matured. He was no longer simply the lone hero arriving to restore order. He became part of structured societies, ranches, military units, communities, navigating the tensions between individual will and collective responsibility. His voice, deep and measured, carried gravity. Audiences had grown accustomed to its cadence. He did not rush dialogue. Pauses became part of his presence. Silence often communicated more than speech. The late 1940s also saw increasing collaboration between Wayne and directors who recognized his capacity for layered performance. Howard Hawks drew out an undercurrent of vulnerability beneath strength. Ford emphasized dignity and ritual within frontier life. At the same time, Wayne remained associated with broader cultural values. In the post-war climate, the Western provided reassurance that order could be maintained, that leadership, or even when flawed, was essential. Yet within these narratives, moral certainty sometimes gave way to ambiguity. Characters wrestled with pride, prejudice, and regret. The frontier was no longer depicted as purely heroic terrain. It was a space of conflict and consequence. Wayne's ability to anchor these evolving stories rested on steadiness. His physical movements remained deliberate. When he entered a frame, the camera often held its position, allowing him to occupy space without haste. By the end of the decade, he had become inseparable from the Western genre. His silhouette against the desert sky became emblematic of American frontier myth. But the hero he portrayed was no longer entirely uncomplicated. The groundwork laid in B-westerns, refined in Stagecoach, strengthened during wartime films, now deepened into complexity. He could play authority figures whose decisions carried weight. He could embody both leadership and the burdens that accompanied it. The Western itself had matured alongside him. No longer dismissed as secondary entertainment, it had become a vehicle for exploring identity and responsibility. And John Wayne, with his steady stride and measured tone, stood at its centre. As the 1950s approached, the collaboration between John Wayne and John Ford became one of the most defining partnerships in American cinema. Together, they shaped not only individual films, but the visual language of the Western itself. Their work returned repeatedly to Monument Valley, the vast red landscape straddling the Arizona-Utah border, where mesas rose like ancient monuments against open sky. Ford had first brought Wayne to Monument Valley for Stagecoach in 1939. The setting proved transformative. Its immense scale dwarfed human figures, placing riders and wagons within a grand, almost mythic space. The land was not background, it was presence. In the years that followed, Ford returned there often, and Wayne's silhouette became inseparable from those towering formations. In She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, 1949, Rio Grande, 1950, and other entries in the so-called Cavalry Trilogy, the landscape framed stories of duty, honour, and the quiet rhythms of military life on the frontier. Ford's direction emphasized ritual and restraint. Scenes unfolded slowly. Dialogue was deliberate. Long shots allowed viewers to absorb both character and terrain. Wayne thrived within this style. His measured movements and grounded posture complemented the director's visual patience. The partnership was not without complexity. Ford was known for stern methods and sharp criticism. Wayne, though respectful, developed increasing confidence over time, yet their shared understanding of cinematic storytelling sustained the collaboration. Ford recognized that Wayne embodied the frontier archetype he sought to portray: strong, weathered, yet capable of introspection. One of the most significant outcomes of this partnership emerged in 1956 with The Searchers. Though this film belongs to the next chapter in Wayne's evolution, its foundation lay in years of shared artistic trust. In Ford's films, Wayne's characters were often men shaped by duty: cavalry officers, settlers, community leaders. They were neither flawless nor entirely solitary. They belonged to institutions and traditions larger than themselves. The pacing of these films contrasted with the brisker westerns of earlier decades. Moments of quiet reflection were common. Characters stood against sweeping horizons, pausing before action. The silence of Monument Valley, punctuated only by wind or hoofbeats, became part of the narrative texture. Wayne's screen presence matured further within this context. He no longer needed overt displays of strength. Authority emanated from stillness, while a slight tilt of the head or narrowing of the eyes conveyed internal conflict. The 1950s were also years of broader cultural tension. The Cold War intensified. American society grappled with questions of identity and ideology. The Western, in Ford's hands, became a space for exploring loyalty, community, and sacrifice. Wayne's political views, increasingly vocal, aligned with conservative ideals of patriotism and traditional values. Off-screen, he participated in industry organizations and spoke publicly on national issues. On screen, his characters often embodied stability in uncertain times, yet Ford's direction occasionally introduced ambiguity. Authority figures were not always correct. Frontier life carried costs. The partnership allowed Wayne to navigate these layers without abandoning the steadiness that defined him. Monument Valley itself became almost symbolic. Its red earth and vast sky suggested permanence. Against that backdrop, Wayne's characters appeared grounded and enduring. The repetition of that setting across films reinforced the mythic quality of the Western hero. Audiences came to expect Wayne framed against those messes, hat brim shading his eyes, posture firm against wind. The image transcended individual stories and entered cultural memory. By the mid-1950s, the collaboration between Wayne and Ford had yielded a body of work that shaped global perceptions of the American West. Their films were exported internationally, introducing audiences abroad to landscapes and legends rooted in American history yet stylized through cinema. The partnership demonstrated that the Western could carry emotional and philosophical weight. It was no longer confined to action alone. Through deliberate pacing and visual grandeur, Ford and Wayne transformed it into something reflective. As the decade progressed, this collaboration would reach its most searching expression in The Searchers. But even before that landmark, Monument Valley had already become a stage upon which John Wayne's persona deepened, shaped by wind, sky, and the quiet authority of shared vision. In 1956, John Wayne appeared in a film that would come to define not only his career, but the Western genre itself. Directed once again by John Ford, The Searchers presented a portrait of the American frontier that was more searching, more conflicted than any Wayne had previously undertaken. Wayne portrayed Ethan Edwards, a Civil War veteran who returns to Texas after years away. Shortly after his arrival, Comanche raiders attack his brother's homestead, killing members of the family and abducting his young niece Debbie. Ethan sets out on a years-long search to find her. At first glance, the narrative resembles familiar Western structures: pursuit across vast landscapes, confrontation between settlers and native tribes, endurance against hardship. Yet within this framework, Ford and Wayne crafted something deeper. Ethan Edwards is not a simple hero. He is driven, determined, and skilled, but he is also consumed by bitterness. His hatred of Native Americans is stark and unsettling. The search that begins as rescue carries the possibility of darker intent, whether Ethan seeks to save Debbie or to destroy her, rather than allow her to remain among the Comanche. Wayne approached the role with restraint. He did not soften Ethan's severity. Instead, he allowed silence to convey the character's inner rigidity. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. His movements were deliberate, almost heavy at times. The familiar steady stride remained, but it carried weight. Monument Valley once again served as backdrop. Yet the landscape felt less romantic and more isolating. The vastness emphasized the emotional distance between Ethan and those around him. The horizon stretched endlessly, mirroring the long years of pursuit. Ford framed Wayne frequently in doorways and thresholds, visual motifs that suggested separation. In the film's final image, Ethan stands alone outside a home, turning away as the door closes. The gesture is quiet, yet profound. The performance marked a turning point. Wayne demonstrated that his persona could encompass moral ambiguity. The unwavering certainty of earlier roles gave way to introspection and unease. Ethan's determination is admirable in endurance, yet troubling in motive. Audiences in 1956 encountered a Western that did not resolve neatly. The frontier was not purely heroic terrain. It was marked by violence, prejudice, and unresolved grief. Wayne's embodiment of Ethan made that complexity credible. Critics and scholars in later decades would revisit The Searchers repeatedly, recognizing it as one of the most influential American films ever made. Directors from around the world cited its visual composition and thematic depth as inspiration. For Wayne, the role expanded his artistic reputation. He was no longer viewed solely as a symbol of straightforward patriotism or frontier justice. He had entered territory of psychological depth. Yet even in this darker portrayal, the elements that defined him remained. His voice was steady, rarely raised. His authority emanated from posture rather than volume. When he delivered lines, they carried measured gravity. The collaboration with Ford reached a point of artistic culmination here, and years of shared understanding allowed Wayne to trust the director's vision. The result was a film that transcended genre. The 1950s were marked by broader cultural reflection in the United States. Questions of identity, belonging, and moral certainty were increasingly present. The Searchers mirrored those tensions within the framework of frontier myth. Wayne's willingness to inhabit Ethan Edwards without overt justification revealed growth. The hero could now be flawed, haunted, and isolated. The film did not diminish his stature. Instead, it deepened it. The rider who once entered Monument Valley with clear purpose now traversed it with complicated intent. By the late 1950s, John Wayne had secured his place as one of Hollywood's most recognizable figures. His work with John Ford and other prominent directors had elevated the Western into a vehicle of artistic weight. Yet Wayne's ambitions extended beyond acting alone. He sought not only to embody frontier myth, but to shape it directly. That ambition culminated in The Alamo, 1960, a large-scale historical epic that Wayne both directed and starred in. The project had occupied his imagination for years. The story of the 1836 siege in Texas, a small band of defenders holding out against overwhelming forces, aligned closely with themes he valued: sacrifice, resolve, and patriotic endurance. Wayne cast himself as Davy Crockett, the Tennessee frontiersman whose legend had long occupied American folklore. The production was immense in scope. Sets were constructed in Texas to recreate the mission compound. Thousands of extras participated in battle scenes. The scale rivaled major studio epics of the era. Directing demanded a different kind of steadiness. Wayne was accustomed to performing before the camera, allowing directors to shape composition and pacing. Now he bore responsibility for the entire vision. Coordinating cast, crew, and logistics required focus and stamina. The tone of The Alamo reflected Wayne's reverence for the subject. The defenders were portrayed with dignity and moral clarity. Dialogue emphasized loyalty and courage. The film did not dwell heavily on ambiguity. Instead, it affirmed sacrifice as foundational to national identity. Upon its release, The Alamo received mixed critical responses. Many acknowledged its ambition and scale. Others noted its length and solemn pacing. Yet commercially, it achieved considerable success and earned several Academy Award nominations. For Wayne, the project represented personal fulfillment as much as professional achievement. He had taken on not only the role of legendary frontiersman, but also the burden of shaping narrative interpretation. The early 1960s also saw him appear in other large productions. In The Longest Day, 1962, he portrayed Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort during the D-Day invasion. The film's ensemble structure placed him among numerous actors, yet his presence remained distinct, steady amid chaos. During this period, Wayne's screen persona maintained consistency. His voice carried the same measured cadence, his stride remained deliberate, yet age was beginning to introduce subtle changes. Movements were less swift than in earlier decades. The weight of years added gravity. In 1964, he received a diagnosis that would mark a significant turning point in his personal life: lung cancer. Though he had long been associated with cigarettes on screen, the illness introduced vulnerability. He underwent surgery to remove part of his lung. The operation was successful, and Wayne returned to work. Public knowledge of his health struggle reinforced an image of resilience. He spoke openly about recovery, encouraging medical vigilance. The episode did not diminish his resolve, rather, and it deepened public perception of endurance. The 1960s were a period of cultural transformation in the United States. Social movements, political tensions, and generational shifts reshaped national identity. The Western genre itself faced re-examination, with filmmakers introducing darker and more revisionist interpretations. Wayne remained committed to traditional portrayals of heroism. His films during this decade often reaffirmed clarity of conviction. While younger directors experimented with ambiguity and cynicism, Wayne's roles upheld steadiness. Yet within that steadiness, there were hints of reflection. The frontier myth he had helped define now existed in dialogue with changing cultural values. Through epic ambition and personal trial, the late 1950s and early 1960s expanded his legacy beyond performance alone. He had directed a monumental historical drama. He had faced serious illness. He had continued working without visible retreat. The silhouette beneath the wide hat remained recognizable. By the late 1960s, the American film industry was undergoing visible transformation. Younger directors introduced grittier realism. Traditional genres were being reconsidered, sometimes deconstructed. Westerns, once among Hollywood's most dependable forms, faced competition from revisionist interpretations that questioned the myths of the frontier. Within this shifting landscape, John Wayne continued to embody the older tradition, the steady hero shaped by conviction rather than doubt. Yet in 1969, he delivered a performance that both honoured that tradition and subtly expanded it. The film was True Grit, directed by Henry Hathaway. Wayne portrayed Rooster Cogburn, a US Marshal hired by a determined young girl to track down her father's killer. The character differed in important ways from Wayne's earlier roles. Cogburn was aging, rough around the edges, and somewhat dishevelled. He wore an eye patch over one eye, drank heavily, and spoke with dry humour. Unlike the composed officers of Ford's Cavalry trilogy or the haunted intensity of Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, Rooster Cogburn carried a looser, almost self-aware tone. His authority remained intact, but it was accompanied by gruff wit and visible weariness. Wayne embraced these qualities without sacrificing steadiness. His voice, though seasoned by years, retained its deliberate cadence. He did not rush lines for comedic effect. Rather, humour emerged through timing and understatement. The film balanced moments of levity with decisive action. The role resonated strongly with audiences. In an era when cinema often emphasized youth culture and social upheaval, Wayne's portrayal of an aging lawman reclaiming purpose carried unexpected warmth. In 1970, he received the Academy Award for Best Actor for his performance in True Grit. After decades of prominent roles and cultural influence, this recognition marked a formal acknowledgement of his enduring impact. When he accepted the award, his speech was brief and modest, reflecting the same measured demeanour that had defined his career. The late 1960s were also marked by national tension, the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and political division. Wayne's public statements during this period reflected his conservative convictions. He supported strong national defence and expressed firm opinions about American identity. These views resonated with some audiences and alienated others. Yet on screen, True Grit offered something less confrontational, a portrait of aging resilience. Rooster Cogburn was not a symbol of unyielding ideology. He was flawed, humorous, and quietly steadfast. The film's success reaffirmed Wayne's box office appeal. Though the cinematic landscape had shifted toward experimentation, there remained a strong audience for his style of storytelling. His physicality, while inevitably altered by age and earlier health challenges, retained presence. The famous horseback charge near the film's climax, reins clenched in his teeth, rifle in hand, evoked echoes of earlier vigour while acknowledging the passage of time. Wayne did not attempt to compete with younger actors in speed or intensity. Instead, he leaned into maturity. The weathered face, the deliberate pace, the gravelly authority, these became strengths rather than limitations. True grit thus stands as both affirmation and adaptation. It did not abandon the Western tradition Wayne had helped build. Instead, it allowed that tradition to age gracefully, acknowledging experience without surrendering dignity. As the 1970s approached, his film output slowed slightly, but he remained active. The Western, though less dominant, still provided a stage for his presence. The Academy Award did not change his demeanour. He continued working with the same steadiness that had carried him from Glendale football fields to Monument Valley mesas. Recognition had arrived, but it did not alter the stride. The horizon stretched onward. As the 1970s unfolded, the landscape of American cinema shifted decisively. A new generation of filmmakers emerged, bringing with them altered rhythms, looser narratives, and a willingness to question established myths. The Western, once the defining genre of American storytelling, appeared less frequently on studio schedules. Urban dramas and political thrillers gained prominence. Stories reflected uncertainty rather than affirmation. John Wayne, by now in his 60s, stood as a figure shaped by an earlier era. Yet he did not retreat entirely. Instead, he continued to select roles that aligned with his established persona while acknowledging the passage of time. In 1971, he appeared again as Rooster Cogburn in Rooster Cogburn and the Lady, a sequel to True Grit. Though lighter in tone, the film reaffirmed the appeal of the aging marshal. Wayne's performance carried familiarity rather than reinvention. The eye patch, the measured stride, and the gravelly voice were now part of cultural memory. His health, however, required attention. The lung surgery of 1964 had reduced physical stamina, and though he continued working, long shooting schedules demanded care. He maintained a disciplined approach, conserving energy between scenes and relying on controlled movement rather than athletic display. The evolving style of filmmaking during the decade often emphasized ambiguity and anti-heroes. Directors such as Sam Peckinpah presented westerns marked by violence and moral uncertainty. Younger actors brought different sensibilities to the screen. Wayne remained committed to clarity. His characters upheld principles of loyalty and personal responsibility. In a time when narratives increasingly questioned traditional authority, his presence represented continuity. In 1976, he undertook what would become his final film, The Shootist. Directed by Don Siegel, the story centered on J.B. Brooks, an aging gunfighter diagnosed with terminal cancer who seeks to control the manner of his final days. The role carried unmistakable parallels to Wayne's own life. The film's tone was reflective rather than triumphant. Brooks does not ride toward endless horizons. He confronts mortality with quiet dignity. Wayne portrayed him without sentimentality. His movements were slower, his voice lower, yet the authority remained. Throughout The Shootist, there is an awareness of conclusion. The frontier itself appears to be fading, overtaken by modernity. The aging gunfighter belongs to a time passing away. Wayne's performance embraced that awareness. There was no attempt to disguise age. Instead, experience became the character's strength. Critics recognized the film as a fitting farewell. It allowed Wayne to embody not only the mythic West, but its closing chapter. Off-screen, he continued to speak publicly on political issues. His views were direct and often controversial. He supported strong national defense and traditional values, aligning with conservative movements that gained visibility during the decade. Yet despite political division, his cinematic legacy remained intact. Audiences who had grown up watching him ride across Monument Valley now saw him confront mortality with steadiness. The 1970s were not years of explosive reinvention for Wayne. They were years of consolidation. The persona built over decades was allowed to age openly. He did not chase changing trends. Instead, he stood firm within his established identity. As film culture diversified and experimented, John Wayne's final performances offered continuity, a reminder of a style shaped by patience and resolve. The gunfighter in The Shootist seeks dignity in ending. In portraying him, Wayne seemed to acknowledge his own long journey from young prop man to enduring symbol. The screen would soon darken on his presence, but the stride, though slower, remained steady to the end. After completing The Shootist in 1976, John Wayne stepped away from filmmaking. The decision was not announced with ceremony, nor framed as retirement in grand terms. Instead, it unfolded quietly. The physical demands of production had grown heavier with time, and his health required increasing attention. The parallels between his final character, J.B. Brooks, and his own condition did not go unnoticed. In The Shootist, the aging gunfighter confronts cancer with a desire for dignity and self-determination. Wayne himself had faced lung cancer in 1964 and, in the late 1970s, would battle stomach cancer. Despite medical challenges, he remained publicly visible. He made appearances at events, spoke at gatherings, and continued to advocate for causes he believed in. His voice, lower now, touched by age, retained its deliberate cadence. The late 1970s were marked by shifting national sentiment. The United States had experienced political scandal, economic difficulty, and the lingering aftermath of Vietnam. Our cultural confidence appeared altered from the optimistic post-war years that had once framed Wayne's ascent. Yet for many Americans, he remained a symbol of steadiness. His screen image, forged across decades of westerns and wartime dramas, evoked clarity and resolve. In 1979, his health declined significantly. On June 11, 1979, John Wayne died at the age of 72 in Los Angeles. News of his passing travelled quickly across the nation. Tributes arrived from colleagues, political leaders, and audiences alike. He was remembered not only as an actor, but as an emblem of a particular vision of America: expansive, self-reliant, enduring. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement describing him as a symbol of the American spirit. Flags were lowered in some communities. Television networks aired retrospectives of his films. His funeral was held privately, reflecting the reserved tone he had often preferred in personal matters, where he was buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in Newport Beach, California. For years, the location of his grave was kept discreet, consistent with his family's wishes for privacy. The figure who had once ridden across Monument Valley now rested quietly by the Pacific coast. In the months following his death, his films returned to television screens with renewed frequency. Younger audiences encountered his work for the first time, while older viewers revisited familiar scenes: the rifle spin in Stagecoach, the solitary figure in The Searchers, the reins clenched between teeth in True Grit. His public persona remained intertwined with debate. Admirers celebrated his patriotism and consistency. Critics examined his political statements and the historical narratives his films had reinforced. Yet even amid differing interpretations, few denied his significance within cinematic history. The final years of his life did not diminish the scale of his legacy. Instead, they offered a closing chapter consistent with the persona he had long portrayed, facing adversity directly, without theatrical display. There were no dramatic reinventions, no abrupt departures from character. The steady voice softened, but did not falter. As the 1980s approached, American cinema moved further into new styles and genres. Blockbusters would come to rely on advanced effects and rapid pacing. Yet within that accelerating rhythm, the image of John Wayne remained anchored in slower cadence. His death marked the end of a direct connection to Hollywood's classical era, a bridge stretching from silent film apprenticeships to widescreen epics. The boy from Winterset who became the Duke had traversed more than geographic frontiers. He had crossed decades of cultural change, shaping and reflecting American myth along the way. The rider had reached the horizon, and the screen, for a moment, held stillness. After John Wayne's passing in 1979, attention gradually turned from the events of his life to the meaning of his image. More than many actors of his generation, Wayne had become inseparable from a genre, and that genre, the Western, had long functioned as a vessel for American myth. The Western was never merely about horses and gunfights. From its earliest silent incarnations, it told stories about expansion, settlement, justice, and identity. It offered a vision of open land and individual resolve. Through decades of performances, Wayne's presence came to embody that vision. In films such as Stagecoach, Red River, Fort Apache, and The Searchers, he portrayed men who stood at thresholds, between wilderness and settlement, between law and disorder, between solitude and community. The frontier setting amplified these tensions. Wide skies and empty landscapes created space for moral choice. Wayne's style reinforced the mythic quality of these stories. He moved slowly, as if conscious of the weight of history beneath his boots. His voice carried authority not through volume but through certainty. He rarely appeared hurried. Even in moments of confrontation, there was composure. This composure aligned with a particular interpretation of American character. Steady under pressure, guided by conviction, reluctant to speak excessively. In this way, Wayne's screen persona extended beyond individual films and into cultural symbolism. The Western genre itself evolved across the 20th century. In early decades, it presented clear distinctions between hero and villain. By the 1950s and 1960s, filmmakers introduced complexity and moral ambiguity. Wayne participated in that evolution, most notably through Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, where prejudice and obsession shadowed heroism. Yet even as the genre darkened, the Usage Wayne's presence maintained a core steadiness. He did not abandon the belief in personal responsibility. His characters might wrestle with internal conflict, but they ultimately acted with purpose. International audiences encountered American frontier myth largely through westerns. Monument Valley, filmed repeatedly by John Ford and others, became synonymous with the American West in global imagination. Wayne's silhouette against those mesas was exported across continents. This cinematic West was stylized. It simplified complex histories. It foregrounded certain narratives while leaving others at the margins. In later decades, scholars and filmmakers would revisit these stories, questioning omissions and reframing perspectives. Yet regardless of revision, the foundational imagery remained influential. The Western shaped expectations of courage, self-reliance, and the moral testing of individuals against open landscapes. And Wayne's long career coincided with the height of that genre's influence. He became, in effect, its human anchor. While other actors appeared in westerns, few embodied the form so consistently across decades. The durability of his image lies partly in repetition. Audiences saw him ride across deserts again and again. The ritual of hat, horse, and horizon became familiar. But durability also rests in tone. Wayne did not portray heroes as flamboyant or restless. He portrayed them as grounded. That grounding allowed myth to feel accessible rather than abstract. In the years following his death, westerns would continue to evolve, sometimes deconstructing the very ideals they once affirmed. Yet even in revisionist interpretations, echoes of Wayne's era remained visible. The Western as American myth cannot be separated from his contributions. He did not invent the genre, nor was he its only star. But he gave it a face recognized around the world. When audiences imagine the classic Western hero, steady stance, low voice, eyes scanning distant hills, they often imagine John Wayne. The myth endures not because it is static, but because it adapts. And within its foundation stands the figure who rode through its most expansive decades. The frontier, real or imagined, continues to stretch outward. And somewhere along its edge, the silhouette remains. In the decades following John Wayne's death in 1979, his presence did not fade quietly into the background of film history. Instead, it settled into something more permanent, an outline fixed against the broad canvas of American cinema. The late 20th century brought rapid technological change to filmmaking. Special effects grew increasingly sophisticated. Editing became faster. Genres blended and shifted. Yet even as action films adopted new rhythms, many retained echoes of the Western hero's composure, the steady figure who stands firm before chaos. Wayne's influence extended beyond direct imitation. Few actors attempted to replicate his exact mannerisms. His deliberate stride and measured cadence belonged to a specific era. Instead, his legacy appeared in broader qualities: physical authority without haste, dialogue delivered with restraint, heroism grounded in resolve rather than spectacle. Film historians frequently positioned him within the classical Hollywood era, a period characterized by clear storytelling, strong moral arcs, and careful pacing. His career spanned from the final years of silent film to the threshold of modern blockbuster cinema. In that span, he became a bridge between foundational Hollywood and its later reinventions. Retrospectives of Western cinema almost invariably return to his work, Stagecoach is cited as a genre-redefining achievement. The Searchers is regularly included in lists of the greatest American films ever made. True Grit remains a touchstone for portrayals of aging heroism. His image also entered popular culture beyond film. References to the Duke appear in music, literature, and political commentary. The name became shorthand for a certain kind of American masculinity, stoic, direct, and unembellished. Yet legacy, like myth, carries complexity. As cultural conversations broadened, and critics re-examined elements of his filmography and public statements, discussions of representation, historical accuracy, and political rhetoric invited deeper scrutiny. These conversations did not erase his contributions. Instead, they situated him within evolving perspectives. The Western genre itself has been revisited and reframed in light of new scholarship and social awareness. Through these reassessments, Wayne remains central, both as symbol and subject of inquiry. His films serve as documents of their time, reflecting both ideals and limitations of mid-20th century storytelling. Younger audiences encountering his work often note its deliberate pacing. Scenes unfold without the rapid cuts common to contemporary cinema. Dialogue breathes. Landscapes linger in long shots. There is space between words. That space is part of his enduring appeal. The rhythm of his performances offers contrast to modern urgency. His presence suggests steadiness in a medium that has grown increasingly kinetic. Beyond the screen, institutions and communities have honoured his contributions. Airports, museums, and commemorative events bear his name. Film festivals screen restored prints of his work. Scholars publish analyses exploring the intersections of myth, masculinity, and national identity within his roles. The silhouette that once rode across Monument Valley remains among the most recognizable images in American film history. Hat brim angled against sunlight, shoulders squared. The posture alone communicates intention. In life, Wayne navigated acclaim, controversy, illness, and change without dramatic reinvention. In death, his image has remained fixed, neither exaggerated nor diminished by time. Cinema continues to evolve. New heroes appear with different voices and faces, yet the archetype of the steady figure against a wide horizon persists. John Wayne's life traced the arc of that archetype from apprenticeship to legend. The rider has long since dismounted. The desert wind moves across empty mesas, but in the quiet flicker of projected light, the silhouette still stands, unhurried, resolute, and enduring. As John Wayne's career advanced through the 1940s and 1950s, his public identity extended beyond the screen. While many actors preferred to separate personal beliefs from professional roles, Wayne spoke openly about his convictions. His voice, steady and deliberate in films, carried similar tone in interviews and public appearances. The mid-20th century was a period of ideological tension in the United States. The Cold War shaped political discourse. Debates over communism, national defense, and American identity became increasingly prominent. Within Hollywood, these discussions intersected with concerns about artistic freedom and political loyalty. Wayne aligned himself firmly with conservative principles. He supported strong national defense, traditional values, and anti-communist initiatives. In the late 1940s, he became associated with the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization formed in response to perceived political influence within the film industry. And roles he selected often echoed these convictions, portraying military leaders, lawmen, and figures committed to duty. In 1952, he publicly supported Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential campaign. Later, he would back Barry Goldwater in 1964 and express support for Richard Nixon. His endorsements were not subtle. He spoke plainly, consistent with the directness of his screen persona. These positions did not pass without criticism. As American society experienced cultural transformation during the 1960s, younger audiences and artists often questioned traditional narratives. Wayne's statements on social and political issues sometimes drew controversy. Yet he did not alter his tone in response. His public manner remained composed and firm. Even when addressing contentious topics, he spoke with measured cadence rather than emotional intensity. His political engagement extended into film projects as well. The Green Berets, 1968, which he co-directed and starred in, presented a supportive portrayal of American involvement in Vietnam. Released during a period of increasing opposition to the war, the film reflected his unwavering stance. Critics viewed the film through the lens of political debate. Supporters praised its clarity of conviction. Opponents questioned its perspective. Wayne, however, stood by the project as an expression of patriotism. Throughout these decades, his political voice became inseparable from his public image. For some, he embodied steadfast American resolve. For others, he symbolized resistance to social change. Yet even within disagreement, his consistency was unmistakable. He did not shift positions with prevailing trends. The steadiness visible in his Western heroes carried into civic life. As he aged, his speeches slowed slightly, shaped by years and health challenges, but the core tone remained. He emphasized responsibility, loyalty, and belief in national strength. The blending of screen persona and political conviction created a singular presence in American culture. Wayne was not simply an actor who expressed opinions. He was a public figure whose identity had been shaped by decades of portraying authority and endurance. In later years, discussions of his legacy often include examination of these political dimensions. His films and statements are analysed together, revealing the interplay between art and ideology. Yet regardless of interpretation, one quality persists. He spoke as he acted, without haste, without elaborate flourish, and without retreat. The Western hero who faced open landscapes with steady gaze also faced public debate with the same composure. And so his voice, like his stride, moved forward, deliberate and unwavering, through decades of cultural change. Behind the wide-brimmed hat and steady silhouette known to audiences around the world, John Wayne's private life unfolded with rhythms less mythic and more human. Though his screen persona projected constancy and resolve, his personal experiences were shaped by relationships, family, and the demands of long years in motion pictures. Wayne was married 3 times and was the father of 7 children. His first marriage to Josephine Alicia Saenz in 1933 began during the years when his career was still stabilizing. The couple shared 4 children. Those were years of steady work in B-westerns, modest income compared to later decades, and gradual ascent toward prominence. The demands of filming often required long stretches away from home, location shoots in desert landscapes, studio schedules that stretched late into evening, and promotional travel placed strain on domestic life. By 1945, the marriage had ended in divorce. In 1946, he married Esperanza Chata Bauer, a Mexican actress. This second marriage proved turbulent. Differences in temperament and persistent conflict shaped the relationship, which ended in divorce in 1954. His third marriage, to Pilar Palette in 1954, brought renewed stability. They had 3 children together and remained married until his death, though later years included periods of separation. Pilar's presence coincided with the height of Wayne's post-war fame and the production of large-scale films. As a father, Wayne maintained a complex balance between professional obligation and family involvement. His children later recalled both the formality of his demeanour and moments of warmth. He valued discipline and independence, encouraging self-reliance while maintaining expectation. His home life reflected comfort achieved through decades of success. He owned property in Newport Beach, California, where he enjoyed time by the ocean. The rhythm of waves and harbour life offered contrast to desert landscapes and studio lights. He also maintained a yacht, the Wild Goose, on which he spent time with family and friends. The sea, like the open west, carried a sense of space and calm. Those close to him described these moments as relaxed, removed from the structured authority of his screen image. Despite his commanding presence in public, Wayne could be informal among friends. Stories from colleagues describe humour and storytelling shared in quieter settings. Yet even in relaxed moments, the measured cadence of his speech remained recognisable. Illness added another layer to private life. The lung surgery in 1964 required extended recovery. Family members witnessed vulnerability not often seen by audiences. His later battle with cancer during the late 1970s further tested resilience. Throughout these challenges, he maintained outward composure. He rarely spoke publicly about fear or doubt. His private strength mirrored the characters he portrayed, though those close to him understood the effort such steadiness required. As his children grew older, several pursued careers connected to entertainment and public life. the Wayne name carried weight, linking them to an enduring legacy. The balance between public myth and private reality is rarely seamless. For Wayne, the two overlapped, but did not fully merge. The heroic lawman and cavalry officer belonged to carefully framed narratives. The husband and father navigated everyday complexities. His later years at Newport Beach were quieter. The ocean breeze replaced desert wind. Appearances became less frequent. The household rhythms slowed, yet within those quieter spaces the same deliberate presence remained. Tall frame, steady voice, thoughtful pauses before speaking. The life behind the legend was shaped by marriage, fatherhood, friendship, and illness. It was not immune to conflict or challenge, but like the long cattle drives and distant searches portrayed on screen, it moved forward through persistence. The man known as the Duke carried both public and private responsibilities with measured steadiness. Beyond the arc of cinematic myth lay a life lived day by day, anchored not by mesas or cavalry posts, but by family rooms, harbour waters, and the soft light of evening settling along the Pacific coast. After John Wayne's death in 1979, his films did not simply remain as artefacts of a completed career. They became part of an ongoing cultural conversation, one that expanded, shifted, and deepened as decades passed. In the 1980s and 1990s, home video brought his work into living rooms with new accessibility. VHS tapes, and later DVDs, allowed audiences to revisit westerns at will. Younger viewers who had not seen his films in theatres encountered them through family collections and television broadcasts. The measured pacing and expansive landscapes offered a rhythm distinct from contemporary cinema. Film scholars increasingly examined his performances not only as entertainment, but as reflections of American identity. The Western genre was analysed for its role in shaping national mythology, narratives of expansion, justice, and rugged individualism. Within that framework, Wayne's presence occupied a central place. Discussions of the Searchers in particular grew more layered over time. Ethan Edwards's prejudice and isolation prompted examination of how Westerns portrayed Native American communities and frontier conflict. Rather than diminishing Wayne's stature, these conversations underscored the depth and complexity of his most challenging roles. At the same time, retrospectives highlighted the breadth of his filmography. Beyond Westerns, he had appeared in war films, historical epics, and adventure stories. His collaboration with directors such as John Ford and Howard Hawks became subjects of academic study. Public institutions also played a role in preserving his legacy. Museums dedicated exhibits to the history of Western cinema. Restored prints of classic films were screened at festivals. In Newport Beach, where he had spent his later years, the local airport was renamed in his honour, John Wayne Airport, reflecting regional pride in his connection to the community. Yet the cultural conversation was not limited to celebration. As societal awareness evolved, Wayne's public statements and certain portrayals in his films were revisited critically. Debates arose regarding historical representation and political rhetoric. These discussions reflected broader reassessments of 20th century figures. Through it all, his image remained steady within the frame of cinema history. The silhouette against Monument Valley did not shift. The voice, captured on film, remained low and deliberate. The enduring quality of his work lies partly in its visual clarity. Even in an age of digital effects and rapid editing, the long shots and composed scenes of classic westerns retain impact. There is space in those frames, space for landscape, for silence, for reflection. Wayne's performances often rely on minimal gesture. A slight turn of the head, a measured step forward, a pause before speaking. These choices carry weight. They stand in contrast to the heightened intensity common in later action films. For many viewers, revisiting his films evokes familiarity and calm. The Western settings, though stylized, offer expansive quiet. The moral arcs, though sometimes questioned, provide structure. The cultural conversation surrounding John Wayne continues to evolve. New generations approach his work with fresh perspectives. Historians contextualize, critics analyze, audiences reinterpret. Yet certain elements remain constant. The broad shoulders beneath a worn jacket, the hat brim angled against sun, the rider moving steadily across open land. The curtain fell in 1979, but the dialogue did not end. It expanded. Within that dialogue, John Wayne remains both figure and symbol, an actor shaped by his time, and a presence that continues to shape how that time is remembered. The desert wind still moves across old film frames, and the conversation carries on. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, John Wayne's image settled into something more than memory. It became archetype. In film theory, an archetype is a recurring symbol, a figure who represents an idea larger than any single story. For decades, Wayne had embodied the frontier lawman, the cavalry officer, the solitary rider against an open horizon. Over time, these characters fused into a singular outline recognized even by those who had never seen his films in full. The archetype he represented was rooted in stillness. Unlike later action heroes defined by rapid movement and spectacle, Wayne's strength lay in composure. He did not sprint into battle, he walked. He did not shout commands unnecessarily. He spoke in measured tones, allowing silence to frame his words. This composure reflected a particular cinematic era, one in which wide shots lingered and dialogue unfolded without haste. The landscapes of Monument Valley, frequently captured under the direction of John Ford, amplified that stillness. The horizon stretched outward, suggesting permanence. Over time, filmmakers in other genres borrowed elements of this archetype. The stoic detective, the reserved military commander, and the reluctant hero who speaks sparingly. These figures echo qualities Wayne refined across decades. Even in genres far removed from the Western, traces remain. The idea that authority can be conveyed through quiet presence rather than overt force owes something to the pattern he established. The endurance of this archetype also lies in repetition. Wayne appeared in more than 170 films. Audiences saw him again and again in similar settings, on horseback, in uniform, yet framed by doorways or ridgelines. That repetition reinforced recognition. Yet repetition alone does not guarantee longevity. What sustains an archetype is resonance. Wayne's characters often faced moral decisions presented clearly within narrative structure. Whether guarding a stagecoach, leading a cattle drive, or searching across desert terrain, the stakes were tangible. Modern cinema often embraces ambiguity and rapid pacing. Yet the archetype of steadiness persists. In moments of narrative tension, audiences still respond to the figure who stands firm rather than reacts impulsively. Wayne's career bridged silent apprenticeship, wartime storytelling, epic production, and reflective farewell. Through those decades, he maintained continuity in posture and tone. As time advances, individual films may cycle in and out of popularity. Cultural debates may re-examine past portrayals, yet the silhouette remains distinct. In classrooms, scholars analyze his performances as embodiments of mid-century American ideals. In living rooms, families revisit familiar scenes. In film festivals, restored prints reveal the grain of original footage. The archetype has outlived its creator, and perhaps that is the final measure of legacy, when the figure transcends biography and becomes symbol. John Wayne began as Marion Morrison, a boy from Iowa who moved westward with his family. Through discipline and persistence, he became the Duke, then something larger. The archetype stands at the edge of the frame, hat brim shading eyes, shoulders squared against wind. It is an image shaped by celluloid and memory, by performance and repetition. It endures not because it refuses change, but because it offers contrast to change, a steady outline amid shifting light. And so, long after the final scene fades, the rider remains, an enduring figure against the wide horizon of American cinema. When viewed from a distance, the life of John Wayne unfolds like one of the landscapes that defined his career. Wide, steady, marked by long stretches rather than sudden turns. He was born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa, far from the mesas and deserts that would later shape his image. His early years in California were modest, grounded in discipline and athletic aspiration. An injury redirected his course. Work on studio lots introduced him to a medium still discovering itself. There was no instant ascent. The failed promise of the big trail in 1930 might have ended a lesser career. Instead, he worked steadily through years of B-westerns, refining presence and voice. By the time Stagecoach arrived in 1939 under the direction of John Ford, the persona was ready. The decades that followed carried him through wartime films, sweeping epics, and searching dramas. In Monument Valley, his silhouette became inseparable from the Western myth. In The Searchers, that myth grew shadowed and complex. In The Alamo, he sought to shape history directly. In True Grit, age itself became part of the character. His public life moved in parallel with his screen image, steady, outspoken, rooted in conviction. His political views were clear and unwavering. His private life held marriages, children, and the quiet routines of Newport Beach. Illness marked his later years, yet he continued forward with deliberate composure. The shootist offered a reflective farewell, mirroring his own confrontation with mortality. When he died in 1979, the reaction extended beyond Hollywood. For many, it felt as though a familiar landmark had disappeared from the horizon. Yet landmarks do not vanish entirely. They remain in memory, in photographs, in preserved reels of film. The Western genre evolved, was questioned, reinterpreted, sometimes dismantled. But the figure of John Wayne endured within its foundation. His stride was never hurried. His voice rarely rose. Even he did not play heroes who relied on spectacle. Instead, he embodied steadiness. In an age increasingly defined by rapid change, that steadiness stands in quiet contrast. The story of his life does not conclude with dramatic flourish. It settles gently, like dust after a long ride. The camera lingers. The horizon stretches outward. The rider pauses, turns slightly, and moves beyond the frame. The desert grows still. The wind that once carried stagecoaches and cavalry columns softens into quiet air. Monument Valley stands unchanged, its stone faces catching the last light of day. Across that vastness rides a familiar silhouette, hat brim low, shoulders squared, stride unhurried. The films remain, the voice remains, the archetype remains. And in the calm rhythm of projected light, John Wayne continues forward, steady against the horizon, a figure shaped by time and now resting within it.